Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, The Trials of Madame Restell, 19th-Century America's most infamous female physician and the campaign to make abortion a crime, with Nicholas Syrett. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain a vibrant presence in central Massachusetts today. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available afterward on our YouTube page following the live stream. It's part of our series, Women Make History, and you can find other programs in this series on our YouTube channel as well. My name is Scott Casper, and I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources we have been collecting since 1812. Those sources include everything from medical manuals to newspapers to pamphlets about all range of controversies and topics, the range of evidence that makes for good scholarship and good storytelling. And indeed, tonight's speaker is both a meticulous researcher and a compelling storyteller. Nicholas Syrett comes to us from the University of Kansas, where he's professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies and associate dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. His previous books include The Company He Keeps, A History of White College Fraternities, American Child Bride, A History of Minors and Marriage in the United States, and An Open Secret, The Family Story of Robert and John Gregg Allerton. Nick is a co-editor of the Journal of the History of Sexuality. He's contributed op-ed pieces to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, among other outlets. He currently serves as president of the Society for the History of Children and Youth. Nick Syrett's new book, researched in part with a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and researched in part right here at AAS, is The Trials of Madame Restell, 19th-century America's most infamous female physician and the campaign to make abortion a crime. Nick will talk for a bit about Madame Restell's story and then be joined in conversation by Nan Wolverton, AAS's Vice President for Academic and Public Programs. Unfortunately, Ann Fabian, who was supposed to be part of the conversation this evening, was unable to join us. After Nick and Nan talk for a few minutes, we'll open the floor to questions from our audiences, both here in the room in Antiquarian Hall and those of you who are watching on YouTube. Welcome to all of you, and Nick Syrett, welcome back to the American Antiquarian Society.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, great. Okay, so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Nan Wolverton for inviting me to come, and thanks to Scott for the introduction. As Scott said, I did some of the research for this book here at the American Antiquarian Society, so it's delightful to be back here to talk about the results of that research. So The Trials of Madame Restell is both a biography of one person, by most accounts the most famous abortion provider in the 19th century United States. And then, as the subtitle makes clear, it also explains how abortion became criminalized in the United States, using Madame Restell as a case study to do so. So today I'll talk both about Restell and about why women like her became a target of doctors and moral reformers in the middle decades of the 19th century. So let's begin with biography, so you can get a sense of the woman at the center of the story. This is Ann Summers Lohman. As she was first named Ann Trow, she was born May 5th, 1811 in the village of Painswick in the county of Gloucestershire in the western part of England, not far from its border with Wales. Anne was the daughter of John Trow and his wife Ann Biddle Trow. She was baptized in the Church of England a month after her birth on June 9th, 1811. Her parents had been married for almost 10 years at the time of her birth, and her father is listed in various records as a laborer, likely in one of the local textile mills or perhaps in agriculture. Anne was her parents' fourth child after 3 brothers. Ann Biddle Trow would give birth to 5 more children, 4 sons and a daughter, following daughter Anne. So if we're looking for inspiration about why Ann Trow might have wanted to learn how to terminate a pregnancy, her own mother's experience of endless motherhood is likely the place to start. Like many women of her era, the next time Anne Troe appears in historical records is at the moment of her marriage. On March 26, 1829, Anne Troe married 26-year-old Henry Somers in the village of Wootton Bassett, a little under 30 miles southeast of Painswick. Anne was 17 years old. Their daughter, Caroline Somers, was born there the following year and baptized on February 21st, 1830, and she would be their only child. The next step in their lives together was both the most consequential and the one for which there is the least documentation. They emigrated from England to the United States, though we don't know precisely when, because the immigration records have been lost, if they ever existed at all. They had arrived in New York by the late summer of 1831 when they first appear in records there. Soon thereafter, on August 1st, 1831, Henry Somers died of a bilious fever, a catch-all term that referred to any kind of fever that originates in bile. Anne Somers was now the single mother of a daughter who was not yet 2 years old. Anne had one skill, sewing, and this is how she managed to support herself for the next 2 years, during which she remained single. On September 30th, 1833, the New York Spectator printed a tiny notice that Anne Somers had remarried. The groom, Charles Lohman, was born in St. Petersburg, Russia on August 8th, 1809. And I only found out about this marriage. Other people have written biographies of her and they've gotten the date of the marriage wrong. I found this here at the American Antiquarian Society in a digitized record. So you can see the reason this is in yellow is because I was searching for his name and that's what I took a screenshot of. So I am able to date their marriage because of the resources here. 19th century St. Petersburg, from where Charles Lohman came, was home to a large population of ethnic Germans, as well as to 22 periodicals printed in German, which may be where Lohman learned his trade as a publisher. At the time of their marriage, he was 24 years old to Anne Somers' 22. This portrait is the only one we have of Ann Lohman before she began to be depicted by newspaper illustrators as her pseudonym, Madame Restell. It is a miniature painting on a tiny little brooch that was almost certainly commissioned by her husband Charles in the mid to late 1830s, when Ann Lohman was herself only in her late 20s. Ann Lohman first advertised as Madame Restell in 1839, and this is an example of an ad from a year later in 1840 where she's selling what she calls preventive powders. The evidence, and it's circumstantial, suggests that Ann Lohman learned the practice of midwifery from a male doctor named William Evans. She also began buying the medicine she would sell as contraceptive and abortifacient from a local druggist and then advertising it under her own name. And by abortifacient, I mean a medicine that would bring on miscarriage or abortion. Before any kind of government regulation, selling drugs like this was quite common. There's no FDA to regulate these sorts of things at the time. Because she also advertised her services in aiding women in their confinements and in delivering their children, she was actually doing nothing all that new. Her work in medicine built on traditions dating back millennia. For most of human history, women had assisted one another in birth. They were not formally schooled in medicine. Instead, they trained with older women who were already skilled midwives. Some midwives were also relied on by their communities as healers who prescribed various combinations of herbal remedies for a wide variety of ailments. These remedies included emmenagogues that were designed to restore menstruation, which could be blocked by a number of things, one of which was pregnancy. And here I just want to point to the big gray area between emmenagogues and abortion, or abortifacients. Who knows whether the menstruation is being restored because a pregnancy a woman was already pregnant, or it was some other cause. And female physicians like Restell really used that gray area in order to sell things as medicine that also might have the consequence of terminating a pregnancy as well. In the 1830s, when Lohman first trained in midwifery, the field of medicine was at a crossroads. In earlier eras, male doctors assumed medical legitimacy not via attending medical school, but by training alongside practicing doctors, in ways not at all dissimilar from how midwives also trained. The first medical school in the United States, the College of Philadelphia, was not founded until 1765. By the early 19th century, however, increasing numbers of young men were formally training as doctors by attending medical colleges and earning degrees. Even the courses taught at medical colleges were relatively rudimentary, however, and doctors in training combined apprenticeship with 2 years of courses, which themselves were a repetition of one another, the idea being that it'll stick if you do it during the second year as well. For years, and despite the growing number of formally trained doctors, women's reproductive services continued to remain the purview of midwives like Madame Restell. That began to change, however, first in the United Kingdom and France, when male doctors developed the medical fields of obstetrics and gynecology, and began to argue that what they called man midwifery was superior to that of midwifery practiced by women. The male doctors relied on their formal scientific training to make this argument. At the same time, they also introduced a number of instruments into the birthing room. This is especially so for forceps, but also a certain number of medicines as well, to justify both their presence and the superior level of their skill and the cost of the supposed superior level of their skill. Historians have demonstrated that infant mortality actually increased as a result of some of these innovations, which could result in injury and infection. So by 1839, when Ann Lohman first went into business, the stage had been set in the United States for a showdown between male obstetricians and the midwives they were slowly but surely replacing. One other related change before we get back to Restell herself, at this moment in the 1830s, was the legal regulation of abortion, no matter who was performing it, doctors or midwives or someone else entirely. Abortion had been perfectly legal throughout the colonial period of American history, from the earliest moment of English settlement along the East Coast until the 1820s or 1830s, so about 200 years, give or take. The basic rule under English common law, which was in use in the English-speaking colonies, was that abortion was only a misdemeanor if it occurred after quickening, the moment that occurs sometime in the second trimester when a woman feels fetal movement. Before that, no crime at all. We know that Native American people who lived here before European settlers and continued to live here after they arrived also regulated birth via abortion and various herbal concoctions that were meant to terminate pregnancy or restore menstruation. And again, that line is blurry. Basically, early modern forms of birth control. The same was true of enslaved people who were brought from Africa to work on southern plantations and in northern households. They too brought methods with them for terminating pregnancies. So while we're used to thinking about abortion as very much an issue of our times, and certainly it remains so, it is safe to say that so long as people have been getting pregnant, some of them have been attempting, with various degrees of success, to not be pregnant. Within a year of advertising her services, Madame Restell began to refer to herself as a female physician, and that's the phrase I use in the title of the book too. She did not have an MD. The first woman in the United States to receive formal medical training, Elizabeth Blackwell, did not earn her degree until 1849. In using the term physician, I argue that Restell was not trying to deceive anyone, however. She and other New Yorkers would have understood a physician to be a practitioner of medicine, distinct from a surgeon who was capable of operating on people and was without question male. It also bears noting that no medical doctor was licensed at this time. With a handful of short-lived exceptions, states simply did not issue licenses until later in the 19th century. So again, she's not pretending to be something that she is not. Not until 1889 would the Supreme Court rule that states were within their rights to actually require medical licensing. Thus, no unsuspecting patient would have believed that a female physician was formally trained. For Restell, the phrase meant that she was a woman who provided medical services to other women, medical services that were almost exclusively related to that which made women distinct from men, their capacity for pregnancy. Restell was hardly the only woman to call herself a female physician, or even just a physician. Longworth's 1838, 39, and 1840 city directories list an Elizabeth Mott, female physician residing at 119 Spring Street. That's one you can see here. It's just from a city directory. And others in the trade, including Mrs. Bird, who's in the top advertisement, and then Madame Costello in the later advertisement, or the lower advertisement, both one-time competitors of Madame Restell, both use that phrase as well. There's no question that by the later 1840s, female physician, the phrase, became synonymous with abortion in the minds of many, but that should not detract from what those who use the phrase might have meant by it, at least originally. In employing this language, Restell and others like her were not simply describing their trade. Implicitly, they were also asserting their claim on this term at a moment when medicine was changing and women were losing ground in a domain that had largely been theirs for centuries, if not millennia. I want us to emphasize also that female physicians like Restell, Costello, Bird, presumably Elizabeth Spring as well, essentially performed 3 services, all related to women's health care. They delivered babies in lying-in hospitals, which were really no more, that is sort of like a glamour. Lying in hospital makes it sound like it's a lot bigger than it actually is. It's essentially like a room or 2 that they had in their home where they would deliver children. And you can see in this advertisement here, Madame Restell will inform ladies that she offers up suitable and respectable accommodations for ladies on the point of confinement. So she's offering up her service here, not as someone capable of terminating pregnancy, but of delivering children as well. Some also advertise their ability to find new homes for those children during an era when adoption was not yet legally regulated. So if you give birth but you don't want to keep the child, a female physician can help you with that. Opposition to the delivery of children was often very vocal because many assumed, often rightly, that the children being delivered were illegitimate. They were born as bastards. Female physicians were often accused of abetting wealthier men who had seduced working class women on the one hand, or simply of helping to conceal illegitimate pregnancy on the other. Female physicians, of course, also terminated pregnancies, which is eventually what they will become the most famous for. And as I've mentioned, they sold various forms of contraception and emmenagogues as well. Beginning in 1821, first Connecticut and later 9 further states and 1 federal territory, and this is just during the 1820s and 1830s alone, enacted statutes criminalizing certain kinds of abortion. Most of these legal changes came as a result either of sensationalized cases of abortion gone awry, that is, generally the death of a woman at the hands of a provider, or as an effort to protect women from medicine that could be poisonous. The Connecticut law, for instance, was passed after a truly bizarre incident in which a preacher forced the girl he had impregnated to take an abortifacient and then kidnapped her and her sister. It's a story for another day. And the pamphlet is here at the American Antiquarian Society. The early statutes did not fully depart from common law, however, in that most maintained a distinction between abortion pre- and post-quickening. So they're still hearkening back to that earlier common law distinction. Even if they are newly criminalizing the pre-quickening abortions as well. Many of the statutes were explicitly focused on abortifacients alongside other poisons that might be sold or administered to women who sought to terminate their pregnancies. So this is New York's 1829 first statute about abortion. And they passed it as part of a massive rewriting of all of their statutes. It's clear that legislators did not actually vote separately on the part related to abortion. They just passed the entire revised statutes altogether. So a smaller committee would have developed this. And they passed it in conjunction with other statutes that were meant to regulate doctors who were operating on women while intoxicated and druggists who were selling women medications that were dangerous. In other words, the first anti-abortion statute in New York was more about regulating doctors and protecting women than it was about the fetus. By the 1840s, however, some doctors had much more clearly declared their opposition to abortion. And some of that opposition was articulated in terms of the rights of the fetus and a belief that life began at conception, not at the point of quickening. That comes a little bit later, though. New York stiffened its law multiple times from the 1840s through the 1870s, as did most other states, making it a crime not just to administer an abortion, but in some cases criminalizing anyone who aided a woman by even telling her about where she might obtain an abortion. Historians long before me have demonstrated all the reasons that laws like this were appealing to legislators and why doctors rallied around them, not the least of which is that doctors were interested in protecting their own business interests and driving midwives out of business as competition. These statutes, like this one, were very hard to enforce, of course, because most women who successfully obtained an abortion did not tell anyone about it, and certainly not those charged with enforcing the law. So throughout the 19th century, women like Madame Restell continued both to deliver babies and to terminate pregnancies, even though they were breaking the law the entire time. Madame Restell was, I think, pretty easily the most famous of the female physicians. And when I say famous, I really do mean famous. She advertised her products all along the East Coast and made headlines across the country the handful of times that she was put on trial. Newspaper men sold mass-produced transcriptions of her trials on the street corners in New York, which is how I was able to recreate some of those trials for the book. The word Restellism became a synonym for terminating a pregnancy. In 1847, when she was put on trial for administering an abortion to a woman named Maria Bodine, and this is actually the one trial that does result in a year's jail time for her in the prison on Blackwell's Island, now Roosevelt Island, in the East River in New York. The New York Police Gazette published this drawing of Restell that is probably her most famous likeness. It depicts, if you cannot see, Restell with a devil emerging from her womb, which itself is feasting on a baby who may or may not be alive. So you've got the detail over there. It gives you some sense of how she was treated by the press and of how they are already conflating live babies and fetuses, which is also one of the themes that I address in the book, the way that legislators and newspapermen began to liken abortion to infanticide. This worked in a rhetorical way to sway people on the issue of abortion, as if a pre-quickened fetus really were the same thing as a baby born at full term. But it was also the case that Restell and other female physicians were regularly accused of delivering women of their living, breathing infants and then murdering them. There is no question that there was a rise in infanticide in this era when cities were growing, poverty was increasing, and old rules about sex outside of marriage were falling by the wayside. But there's no evidence that female physicians like Restell were responsible for the increase. Plenty of live babies left her lying in hospital in the arms of their mothers or adoptive parents. Here you can see another representation of a similar trend. This is a cartoon from a newspaper called Dixon's Polyanthus from 1841. This is a time of another scandal involving both Restell and Mrs. Bird. And I'll try to point out a few things here because it's a bit blurry. This is death here. That's Madame Restell. She's got tiny little coffins around her skirt. This is Mrs. Bird. You can see because she's got a little bird beak there. And also, I happen to know that she lived at number 18 Oliver Street. And then you can see here, these are three little fetuses here. This is a woman who died having her twin pregnancy terminated. And then this is a woman who sort of figures into the case at that time. She's got a fetus in a jar that she's approaching Restell with. The other thing to know here is that accompanying the cartoon were 5 stanzas of a poem, and each of them is numerically linked. Here there's a number 1, number 2, number 3. So there's a little bit of a poem with each of these characters. I'll read you some of this poetry. The first is the spoken by the 3 fetuses on the left. I only lived to sigh and weep, then in an ash box went to sleep. I drew on breath with grief and pain, and then I sank to rest again. We 3 ne'er saw the lovely earth, we 3 ne'er knew a living birth, but killed by powders in the womb, the river served us for a tomb. And then this next one is this deceased woman here. I was once a maiden fair, but caught in the seducer's stare. 2 twins to me by God were given, and Restell sent us all to heaven. So the given heaven doesn't quite work, but their cartoons and the coverage of Bird, Restell, and later Costello, despite acknowledging the differences between those 3 people, indicted them all with the same charges. They were incompetent, they were murderers, and they encouraged vice and licentiousness. And importantly, they were murdering not just adult women, but also fetuses who were depicted as sentient beings who could speak, in rhyme no less. So there's part of the argument here is that they're contributing to thinking about the fetus as a larger form of life than it actually would have been at the time of a termination. So I want to return to the issue of her fame. Restell became quite wealthy as a result of her trade, and that made people all the more curious and often angry about her. This is one of the more sympathetic representations. The New York Police Gazette ran a story in 1856 reporting on their belief that Madame Restell and her husband did not have any friends. This was the article. She was so notorious that newspapers would report on the minutiae of her daily life, not unlike, at least it seems to me, the features in tabloids that tell us stars. They're just like us, and then we see them at the grocery store. In this case, and I'm quoting here, when they, that is Restell and husband, drive through Broadway, they are shunned by the crowd like a pair of lepers. They are as isolated in a city of 750,000 of inhabitants as they would be on the most desolate spot on God's earth, end quote. This story was reprinted as far away from New York as Wheeling, West Virginia, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a testament to Restell's national fame. Madame Restell was, in many ways, the face of abortion in the 19th century United States. But she presents some difficulties in writing a book about her, and the biggest difficulty is that Madame Restell left behind no records of her own. There are no letters or diaries. There might have been at one point, but if they ever existed, they don't survive. I'm told by a fellow biographer of Restell who contacted her descendants, some of whom live today on Long Island, that they didn't even know who their ancestor was, and certainly they didn't have any long lost papers that anyone could access. If Restell kept business records, those also don't survive, and it's pretty likely that she would have been fairly careful about them during her lifetime, given that by the 1830s, most of what she was doing was illegal. Because of what records do exist, this book is mostly structured around a series of high-profile incidents when Restell appears in the news, goes on trial, or is arrested. And for many of those instances, I was able to locate court records to tell the story, and also to have access to Restell's voice because she was often compelled to testify. In other instances, and this is a place where I cannot overstate how rare it is for a woman in the 19th century, Restell wrote lengthy letters to newspapers that were reporting about her, and the newspapers reprinted those letters in full. These give us a chance to hear her voice, and I'll explore in one instance right now. It is really such a singular voice. She always defended her actions. She often voiced pointed criticism of those who attacked her, including the newspapers that are publishing the letters. And she did all of this without ever quite admitting that what she was doing was illegal. It was a very fine line to walk, and so I want to share one of those instances with you. And it's how I open the book because it's such a wonderful, wonderful encapsulation of her feistiness and also of how famous and controversial she was. So in March of 1855, at which point Restell had been in business for a little over 15 years, a New York newspaper called The Express printed a story about her in which, and this is how mundane the entire thing is, the paper claimed that she had dropped off a large order of linens that she needed to be repaired at the headquarters of an organization called the Shirt Sewers and Seamstresses Union, located at 1 Astor Place, about 1.5 miles north of where Restell then lived on Chamber Street. Later that week, when the Shirt Sewers and Seamstresses Union delivery girl returned part of the order to her home, she claimed, the girl, that she was surprised to see the name Madame Restell on that door. That was not the name on the order. Restell had instead used her legal name, Ann Lohman, when she dropped off the order. But the delivery girl was definitely familiar with the name Madame Restell. That name, to her, was notorious throughout New York and indeed the better part of the United States. Madame Restell was no ordinary client. She was, and here I'm going to use a lot of the language that people use to describe her, the female abortionist, a professor of infanticide, a child murderess, quote, the wretched creature who builds her fortune upon the misfortunes of her sex, caring no more for their sufferings of mind or body than does the butcher for the lives of the animals which it is his business to take, end quote. Or at least that's how newspaper men described her. It would have been difficult to live in New York City in the year 1855 and not be aware of who she was. So the delivery girl rushes back uptown, reports to her supervisor just whose linens the Union of Seamstresses had been tending to. After consultation, the board of managers bundled up her linen and promptly returned it to her, along with a note which explained that, quote, although in need of work, they should never be poor enough to accept patronage from a woman of her character, end quote. it is unlikely that the women employed at the Shirt Sewers and Seamstresses Union, that is, the actual seamstresses, were ever consulted before Ann Lohman's business was refused. The ladies who sat on the board of managers prided themselves on their reputation as upstanding members of society. This was part of the reason that they served voluntarily on the board of this cooperative of, at any given time, between 70 and 100 seamstresses who worked out of a spacious and comfortable workroom, according to the New York Times, and were paid a decent wage, unlike those women who toiled away in sweatshops. The board of lady managers were in a position to refuse good work in the name of virtue. Not so the suffering needlewomen of our city, as the Times put it, who actually worked day in and day out at the union, assembling and repairing the clothing of New Yorkers, as well as the garment manufacturers who profited from their labor. And it's worth noting that this is the job that Ann Lohman had when she first arrived in New York City. She was a suffering needlewoman of New York. The Friday of the following week, March 16th, the New York Express published a short article under the title "Madame Restell Repudiated," recounting the entire incident. Compared to the coverage that she had already garnered in papers in New York, the article, which was only 13 lines long, was pretty insignificant. But that the paper chose to print it at all signals that its editors found it noteworthy. The New York Tribune thought so as well, reprinting the article on the same day, as did other papers in upstate New York. This reporting led to coverage in the New York Atlas 2 days later, wherein the editor claimed that it was, quote, in bad taste to repudiate the small charity which Madame Restell, in all seeming honesty, made. So we have at least one instance of a newspaper defending her actions of giving money to charity. The Atlas also reprinted Madame Restell's own response to the original story, which is what you can see some of here on the slide, which she claimed was false in every particular. She clarified that no assumed name was given. Rather, the work given to them, the union, was for the person whose name was given, that is, Ann Lohman, her legal name. She explained further that no large order was placed last week. Rather, quote, the women of the union had been working for me for the last 6 months, and the last work sent was in their possession for at least 6 weeks, end quote. She claimed that there was no note refusing her business and that no sign announced her name at 162 Chambers Street. Quote, there is not now and never was Madame Restell's name, either on the door or anywhere else in the mansion, end quote. She told the story from her perspective. She had long taken her sewing to the Shirt Sewers and Seamstresses Union, quote, as a matter of charity and benevolence to extend them a helping hand, end quote. On this particular occasion, she explained, she had delivered some sewing on behalf of a lady in the country to the union, quote, believing that in thus contributing to give them employment, I was committing no grievous wrong, but assisting them in the only way they deserved assistance, that is, by furnishing them with work, end quote. Because in some way or another, the board of lady managers of the Shirt Sewers Union had given this story to the newspaper. They had divulged this. Even if in not quite the fashion that the newspaper reported, Restell then excoriated both the union and the Express. She asked rhetorically if it was, quote, an offense to help the needy who loudly call for help. She criticized, quote, the women who reap the fruits of the hard earnings of the poor sewing girls in their employ, accusing the lady managers of profiting from the labors of the seamstresses. She attacked them for revealing her name in the first place. Quote, they could not submit to hide their light or their superlative virtue under a bushel. They must proclaim both the one and the other in the marketplaces and the highways. They must advertise their excessive purity in the newspapers, end quote. She accused the union of using her name to drum up business, claiming that any newspaper article about her would serve as advertisement for their shirt concern. Near the end of her diatribe, she made a series of suggestions. Perhaps it would not be amiss for them to notify the public by a placard or a sign that all persons bringing shirts to be made are required to bring reference from the last place where they had shirts made. And also that all such persons applying to have shirts made or mended must be church members of 6 or 7 years standing. Or just post up moral shirts made here, end quote. With that, she signed off. Usually when Restell wrote into a newspaper, it was in regard to abortion or contraception or some legal action that had been taken against her. But otherwise, the tone of what she was saying here was absolutely typical of her strident defense of herself, and I would argue of her humor as well. About 10 years after this incident, in the mid-1860s, she and her husband Charles built this sizable 4-story mansion at the corner of 52nd Street and 5th Avenue, where she continued to see clients in the basement. This is actually the current location of the Ferragamo leather goods store. I'm not sure if they know what used to exist here, but that is what's there now. Over the course of her career, as I explained, abortion became more and more regulated to the point that by 1872 in New York State, any woman who terminated a pregnancy could herself be charged with a felony, as could anyone who helped her access abortion or procure any medicine or instrument that would assist her in so doing. And in March of 1873, a man named Anthony Comstock succeeded in having Congress pass what was called an Act for the Suppression of, Trade in, and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use, popularly known as the Comstock Act, which effectively criminalized the selling or mailing of pornography, contraception, abortifacients, and any article used to terminate a pregnancy. He also helped to found the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice and struck a deal with the New York City cops that allowed him to stage raids on anyone he believed might be trading in such materials. And eventually, in 1878, it was Anthony Comstock himself who would visit Madame Restell in her office on 5th Avenue, which led to her undoing. But for that story, you will need to read the book. This is her grave in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, near Tarrytown. You don't need to tell me how weirdly timely a book about a 19th century abortion provider happened to become in today's political climate. As you are likely aware, parts of the original Comstock Act are being invoked in order to limit people's ability to receive abortion medications mifepristone and misoprostol through the mails. Truly, if there's one thing that I have learned in researching and writing this book, it is just how little things have changed. While the legal landscape is in many ways quite different than it was in the middle of the 19th century, the issues animating those who seek to limit women's reproductive freedom are strikingly and sadly familiar. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I wanted to first say that for those of you who are joining us a little bit, may have joined us a little bit late, Ann Fabian, who was to be here this evening, is unable to join us. But Nick and I are just going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to your questions, both those who are in the room here and those who are on YouTube. So I actually wanted to start by asking our in-person audience, because it's easier to deal with the folks in here as opposed to on YouTube, how many of you had heard of Madame Restell before? Some, but not all. Yeah, I'm just curious because she clearly was very well known, extremely, as you point out. But it makes me wonder what inspired you to write her story?
Well, I mean, since graduate school, I'd always known who she was. She appears in all histories of New York City, histories of prostitution, contraception, abortion. She's a couple pages in all of those. But I just found her fascinating. I was fascinated by the pseudonym in some way, which is not uncommon. Costello and Bird, also pseudonyms for other names. People took these sort of European, well, with the exception of Bird, not European sounding, but pseudonyms to disguise themselves. And there was something about her I really found fascinating. And there were 2 biographies written of her in the 1980s, one of which is quite solid, one of which is not very good, but neither of which was all that sympathetic to her. And so I was interested in trying to write about her in a way that took seriously why she was doing what she was doing and did not follow most of what is written about her, which is deeply critical. And so that was sort of the inspiration.
Okay.
Intrinsically, I just think she's kind of fantastic and an interesting figure. But then it was, I saw an opportunity to write about her in a way that she'd not been written about before, at least for a book.
Sure. Yeah. So known, but not so well known, and you've brought out aspects that probably were not known before about her.
I hope. Yeah.
Well, given the amount of research that you did for this, Can you say a little bit about how it was for you to work on this book when you were working on it in 2020, 21?
Yeah.
What was that like to get at the resources to write a story like this?
So I was super lucky to have gotten a year off of work academic work in 2020, 21. I got a fellowship, but of course that was also the moment that all of us were locked in our homes. And so I had done a lot of the online newspaper database research, and I'd found all the court records already in like the years leading up to it. So I was in a decent position to be able to start working on things. And what it mostly meant was that I wrote the chapters totally out of order. I would write them when I had enough to be able to write something, and knowing that certain chapters I couldn't do until later. So I didn't come here until after the pandemic, and I was searching for a bunch of different things. I also had to go back to New York City, to the municipal archives, and a few other places. So in one way, I was trapped in my house, as we all were, and that meant that I didn't have lots of distractions and I was free to write all the time. And I was lucky that I had enough done already that I could write some of the chapters, but some of them did have to wait until archives were opened up. The one other thing I would say is there were one or two things I was never able to get to. There are a series of letters that the American Medical Association is in part responsible for the criminalization of abortion. And there's one guy named Horatio Storer who really led that charge. And his letters were stored in one place, inaccessible during the pandemic, and then they were getting moved to somewhere else. So there were some things I just never was able to get to unless I wanted to delay the publication. But by that point I'd written it and I didn't want to any longer. So.
Yeah. So while you were working on this and gathering research, in this way, as a sort of haphazard way, or maybe that's not quite the right word, but
sometimes
it's a process. What was it like for you to balance her story with what was happening in the broader sense in New York, but also in the country in the mid-19th century?
So I knew going into it, based on the work of lots of other talented historians, the basic timeline of the criminalization of abortion. I needed to get at all the laws in New York, which is where she was operating. But that was all laid out. I could figure out that timeline in advance. And then because her story is mostly, or the way I was able to write it, is a story of particular incidents, like a trial or an incident that makes lots of coverage in the newspapers, I basically just did a timeline and slotted things in and then had to make decisions about what made up a chapter. Would I talk about that law changed in addition to this major incident? The thing that actually was somewhat more challenging is tracking all of her family life alongside, because that was mostly not punctuated by big incidents. So she had this one daughter, I didn't talk about it today, but she had a daughter from whom she became estranged. But the daughter had two children who eventually lived with her in that mansion at 52nd and 5th. So she was very close with her grandchildren, and incorporating them and the daughter and son-in-law into the story, that became more challenging because what they were doing, one, there was not tons of evidence for it. Because it mostly would come in sort of minor mentions in newspaper articles or some later trial records that involved the children and the grandchildren. But slotting that in was more challenging, I guess.
You mentioned that her husband was a publisher.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about his role in her world and the whole business, really?
So they were really a team. He had way more pseudonyms than she had. He also went by a Dr. A.M. Morisseau, but he had like 7 other French doctor pseudonyms, all of which harkened back to actual founders of gynecology in France, but with maybe 1 or 2 letters changed. He sold the same pills that she did. He operated a business that for a while they operated on a street corner where his business was on one corner and hers was on the other, and you could go between the houses. He also published a book called The Married Woman's Private Medical Companion by A.M. Morisseau, most of which, well, about half of it was cribbed, directly plagiarized from other sources. And many of the footnotes also say things like, and if you would like access to this kind of contraception, please write to Madame Restell at 162 Chambers Street. So it was like, and it was reprinted many times. So they were really like a team in what they were doing. And they employed her younger brother as well, Joseph, who like worked in the sort of front of house, serving people who came for medicines and so forth. So I think there's no way of knowing how much she developed all this on her own. They really seem like a team effort. It's my belief that when someone performed an abortion, a manual abortion on premises, she was doing that. But certainly in everything else, they were doing it as a team. The selling, the advertising. He wrote, and I use that loosely, the book, because he relied on at least half of it other people's words. But he was on the sort of publishing end of things.
And when she was imprisoned
Yeah.
for a year,
Yes, yeah.
he
He continued to
continuing-
sell. You can track the advertise. So she did not continue to advertise as being, you could not consult her in residence during the year she was in prison because everyone knew she was in prison and they would say, well, who is this person who's doing this stuff? But he was very much in business and continuing to sell the same kinds of compounded drugs that she sold otherwise. Yeah.
I have other questions, but I want to make sure we have time for the audience, our audiences. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Scott is going to walk around with the microphone so that our YouTube audience can hear. So wait for him to get to you.
Good evening. Thank you. A very interesting speech and book. Two questions, please. One, how did she become notorious? And then the other question is the letter to the editor that you read to us was very well written. Sounded like by an educated person. So what can you tell us about her degree of education?
Sure. So the notoriety happened for her and the other two women, Bird and Costello, pretty much at the same time. They advertised enough that they just kept getting arrested, and then the arrests were covered as well. So it all started sort of incrementally in the late 1830s, and they would often get arrested at the same time. They were once arrested for charges that couldn't stick, just of like making a public nuisance of themselves by advertising in the first place. So I think part of what happens here is that she's doing something that midwives have been doing for centuries, but the moment is different. It is a moment at which the world is becoming commercialized. And so she is selling a service that before would have been done on sort of like a barter or trade situation, maybe in a small village among community members, people who knew one another. But she's openly, if sort of euphemistically, advertising for things that are both newly criminalized, and she's selling them and trying to bring in more people. The education question is a good one, and this is partially why I say I don't know the degree to which she and Charles may have worked together on some of the letters or some of the advertising. There's no evidence that she was educated in any formal way that I can find. There's also no evidence really that he was either, though. So we only have their representation as her being the writer of the letters and the sayer of the things. Certainly she was articulate, though, when she testifies in court, and those are, staged situations in which people are asking questions that they have very particular rote answers that they want. But even when she's being asked questions by prosecutors, she's very articulate in the way that she describes what's going on. So it's a bit unknowable.
Sure, yeah. This is fascinating, Nick. I'm Susan Schulten. I teach at the University of Denver. Yeah. And you touched early on what you called the showdown that happens between an emerging discipline or profession of doctors and abortionists or female physicians. And I would love to hear more from you. That I've always wondered this. Did doctors speak with one voice as that professionalization was happening? It's always struck me as very interesting that the emerging medical profession necessarily, I understand that it necessarily genders male, but that it necessarily speaks with a single voice. And I'm wondering what you found when you looked into that.
Yeah, no, they did not speak with one voice. It really is sort of the brainchild of this one guy, Horatio Robinson Storer, who gets the American Medical Association to stand behind this. But in the initial years in the 1850s, where he's surveying other doctors, some doctors say things like, well, impoverished women may need to terminate a pregnancy. There are social reasons that this might not be good. And he cajoles other doctors to get on board. it's kind of a one-man show. But there's definitely evidence that people oppose him in the beginning. He first publishes about this in sort of a local medical journal, and he gets pushback from some people who say, we don't oppose this practice. And there are definitely doctors who are continuing to terminate pregnancies throughout this time, men with MDs, and then the other doctors criticize them as well. It's always been sort of curious to me that, I mean, you could drive midwives out of business by simply saying, you need an MD and you need to be licensed, let's get those things going, and then we, the male doctors with the MDs, could continue to perform the abortions. That is not the track that they take. And other historians, this is really based on their work, have made the case in part that what these doctors really did not like, including some, I think, who genuinely believed that life begins at conception, and this was not a justification for like an ex facto justification, but they sincerely believed that this was wrong. And they very much disliked and would tell stories about women who came to them and said, my courses have stopped, I would like for you to do something about this. And when using this euphemistic language, and the doctors are like, no, I'm not going to do that. And the women say, well, I'm going somewhere else. And so they wrote about this pretty extensively, that they did not like their medical authority being questioned by these women who had money, who could go to some other provider and get what they wanted. They also regularly wrote about how frivolous it was for women to try to regulate birth, to terminate pregnancies. These were women the very women who should be having multiple children, because they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle-class women, whereas immigrants, this also becomes part of the debate, that the immigrant birth rate is high, the middle-class white birth rate is going down. So it's kind of like a perfect storm. But the simple answer is the doctors were not unified, but Storer was convincing, and he did get the American Medical Association on board, and then it had sort of a committee within it that then worked to influence state legislators across the country.
I find this fascinating, especially since I'm a retired OBGYN doctor. And I'm curious, the powder, do we know anything about the chemical composition, what was used? Number two, did she use instruments or just powders? And in terms of the criminalization aspect, was it still considered legal to terminate a pregnancy prior to quickening?
So I'll start at the end and move to the beginning. So after 1829, it was illegal to terminate even a pre-quickened pregnancy. The punishment was lower. So they kept that distinction, meaning that it's a misdemeanor, and she ended up only being punished for terminating a pre-quickened pregnancy. So you can imagine that when people are being prosecuted, an enormous amount of the debate at the trial is trying to date when they think the pregnancy began, and people, when did you last have your courses? Who can attest to this? Because the punishment is much stiffer for a post-quickened pregnancy, or an abortion of a post-quickened pregnancy. But still a misdemeanor for pre, and with up to a year in jail, which is what she did. The abortifacients, there's no question that people were selling quack medicine. But I don't think she was most of the time, but people did. And I think there was sometimes a genuine desire to make sure that women were not harmed. Women did take some of these medications and died as a result of it. So we know that sometimes, at least Restell sometimes sold tansy, which is most of these were like found in wildflowers or plants that grew wild in North America. Tansy, rue, black cohosh, pennyroyal, all of these are found to have abortive characteristics. We also know that she sold abortifacients in the form of ergot, which is a prostaglandin, which does bring on uterine contractions. And she was fairly specific about asking how far along a woman thought she was in pregnancy, and she would prescribe different things or sell different things depending on what she thought the answer was. Sometimes she would say also, like, I'm going to give you these powders. If they don't work, she would sometimes say, you seem like a big, strong, healthy girl. They may not work for you. You may want to come back to me in a few months if your courses have not returned. And what she would then do was essentially bring on a miscarriage. I can't find much evidence that she ever used instruments or that she terminated later term pregnancies. What she generally did was with her hand or sometimes with an instrument, she would, stimulate the uterine wall, or in some way try to bring on a miscarriage. Often women miscarried at home. That is, they came to her to have the miscarriage brought on. They could stay if they wanted to pay an additional fee and stay in the same room where a woman might give birth, and she would stay with them. And there's evidence that she sometimes slept in the same bed with them through to miscarrying the child. But other times people went home and miscarried in a way that was not at all dissimilar from what a doctor would observe in a spontaneous miscarriage. And indeed, some of these women were seen by doctors who didn't realize what it is that they were observing.
Do you know anything about the economics of her life?
Yeah, so I guess there are two answers. What she was selling was not super cheap, and it became more expensive over the course of her career. But in the beginning, it is very clear that she didn't call it this, but she operated on a sliding scale. So she would ask people questions about, essentially, who is the man who got you pregnant? Because she wanted to know what kind of money that man had and what someone could afford. There's evidence that she would take collateral for someone who wanted to pay over time, that she definitely lowered the prices for people who said they could not afford much, and that she sometimes would exchange, and this is both for a termination or for delivery of a child, a woman could come and stay and perform household labor for a couple of weeks in exchange for the delivery of the child. I think that mostly stops toward the end of her career when she is seeing richer women living in that enormous house that you can see there. I don't think she's delivering many children at that point. I think she's mostly terminating pregnancies and selling. But if we look at the actual sort of prices as advertised, it would take a good deal of saving for people to be able to afford what she was offering at a certain point. In the beginning, certainly there was much more give and take. And she seemed to have real sympathy for the plight of people, and that's why she could make adjustments.
Can you say a bit more about, just to build on several things that you've said, about the role that class plays in this story? Because there were riots, there were protests, and often these were working class men who were protesting. I mean, there's so much, and you can't say it all, but it's just, there's so much going on.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple ways of looking at it. I think in the beginning, she is seeing like a multi-classed clientele, poor women and wealthier women. For the service of giving birth, there are lots of options available for wealthier women and for married women. If you are a poor or a single woman who is pregnant, the options are very limited for where you can give birth. If you're a married woman or just a wealthy woman, you hire a doctor to come to your house. And even if you are a poor married woman, there are lying-in hospitals that you have access to, but they won't take you if you're not married. And so this is either poor women who can scrape together the money or women who have wealthier lovers. And there are lots and lots of examples of these men who are paying for all of this. This also, though, and this gets to the riots question, this ends up being pretty upsetting to working class men who protest outside her clinic from time to time, because what they believe is happening is that she's become a way for wealthier men, libertines, rakes, seducers to take advantage of working class women, their sisters, the women of their community, and then Restell is the out, essentially. And so and there are lots of people you could blame. They did blame the seducers as well. There's evidence from lots of people's books about the way that middle-class interlopers were often targeted in working-class neighborhoods. But it's also clear that they saw her sort of as an accomplice of these wealthy men who were getting away with things and using working-class women in order to do it.
We are actually approaching 8 o'clock. And so I want to say thank you to Nick Syrett for introducing us to the Trials of Madame Restell. To learn the rest of her story, buy the book. And for those of you who are here with us in person tonight, you can buy the book right here. Our friends from Tide Pool Bookshop are here and happy to sell you a copy of the book. Also, for those who are here, when you go out of this room, in our reading room, we have placed one of the wonderful prints. It's a cartoon about Madame Restell from the mid-19th century. It's part of the American Antiquarian Society collections, so you can actually see how she's being depicted by a cartoonist in her business. That's in one of the cases as you go out of our reading room. But whether you've joined us here in person or whether you're joining us on YouTube, thank you so much for coming. The program, as I mentioned before, is being recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel afterward. So please tell your friends about it as well. Our next program takes place next Thursday afternoon when Ben Bascom will join us for a virtual book talk on his new book, Feeling Singular: Queer Masculinities in the Early United States. And then we hope you'll join us here on April 11th and 12th. On April 11th, we have a symposium on we're commemorating the 200th anniversary of Isaiah Thomas, our founder, bringing printing to Worcester, Massachusetts. And you can learn more about that story on April 11th when we have a symposium of new insights about Isaiah Thomas. That's the afternoon of Friday the 11th, and our keynote talk by Peter Onuf that evening at 6 o'clock. And then the following day, for those of you who are here in Worcester, whether you are in the room tonight or watching in Worcester on YouTube, we have a community day here at the American Antiquarian Society. That's Saturday, April 12th. We'll be here from 12 to 4. We will have a printer out front, a printer who brings a replica of the 18th century wood press all the way from Utah to do demonstrations out here at Antiquarian Hall. We'll also be offering tours of our building, behind the scenes in the stacks, the conservation lab, everything else. We'll have refreshments. We'll have materials out for you to look at and put your hands on. So we hope that you will tell your friends about that. Bring people here to the American Antiquarian Society. We welcome people to come and visit, as well as to do research here, and also to see programs like the one you've seen tonight. Once more, Nick Syrett, thank you so much, and have a good evening, everyone.